I'm here to talk about a programmatic approach to defining our flood risk and what we can do with that data, expanding on the conversation that Christian just started. So, quick agenda for us here today. Why is this important? What is going on? Who is doing this? How does it work? What's this look like? And what's next? I know it's a lot of questions, but don't worry, the Deluge detectives are on the job. So let's start with why this is important. We've got a lot of problems right now. There's over 2,400 problems identified from our master drainage plan studies, and not quite enough money to tackle those in a reasonable timeline. So those 2,400 problems equate to $3.1 billion worth of capital improvements, and there's some reason to believe that number might be a little low. Some of our master drainage plans are from the 70s and 80s, and they don't always include all those ancillary benefits that we like to get out of projects like open spaces improvements, trail connectivity, things like that. So with our current CIP funding of about $60 million on an annual basis with our 50-50 local government match, it'll take us a little bit over 50 years to address all those problems. And again, with that number being low, could be a lot longer. So the whole idea of a flood risk initiative is to answer the question of how can we optimize our resources and reduce our risk on both a project and a portfolio basis. So before we talk specifically about flood risk, I want to just share a small anecdote from my consulting life. I worked a lot with combined sewers back in the Midwest. I know we don't have a whole lot of those here because we just learn lessons over time, and that's not a great way to develop. But combined sewers are basically where you dig a single trench, put in a single pipe, your sanitary flow goes into that pipe, and then when it rains, your stormwater also goes into that pipe. And once that capacity is overwhelmed, it discharges to the environment instead of backing up into people's basements. You know, those controlled release points are at rivers, and that causes lots of health and safety issues and water quality issues. And once the Clean Water Act was passed in the 70s, the federal EPA said to the sewer authority, you know, you need to stop those combined sewer overflows. They're bad. We don't like that. So the sewer district came up with two different options to address their combined sewer overflows. The first, which is really the holistic solution, was to completely separate the system, put in another pipe that carries that sanitary flow and mitigates any commingling and mitigates those major water quality issues from sanitary flows. That was to the tune of $800 million in 1995 dollars. And their second option was deep, large diameter tunnels, you know, 18 to 30 foot diameter tunnels that span 30 miles to basically be the controlled overflow point for combined sewer overflows. And then as the system regains capacity when storms are over, those tunnels are pumped out. And that secondary option in 1995 was about $500 million. So they did what they could with the current levels of funding and implemented projects here and there, but ultimately they didn't do enough to satisfy what the EPA was looking for. So in 2010, the EPA sued the sewer district, and they entered a consent decree in federal court that basically says you need to achieve a certain level of CSO activation compliance by the year 2035. Over that time period, costs had escalated a little bit. So that option one, that really holistic solution to mitigate combined sewer overflows now is $8 billion, a 10 times increase. And to pursue large diameter tunnels is now $4 billion. This led to significant increases in the sewer rates. They had to issue bonds. They're scrambling for grants. You know, it creates a much more dire situation now that they're required to act by a court order. And I bring this up because our problems are not getting any smaller. As Drew mentioned earlier, rain is getting worse. We need to be planning for that, and you know, we need to plan to have some really tough conversations. Maybe we don't have the right amount of funding available. Maybe we need to ask for more. And a program like Flood Risk is hopefully going to give us the tools to navigate those conversations confidently and with data. Our next performance review is going to be administered by Mother Nature through another 2013 flood, and I hope that we have made the right changes to feel confident that we're protecting people, property, and infrastructure. So this is our mission statement. What is MHFD flood risk? It's an initiative to maximize our impact. Flood risk impacts everybody. The flood risk assessment provides a standardized approach to assess and quantify varying levels of flood risk, enabling the optimal allocation of resources to projects and effectively minimize flood risk in a fair and equitable manner. Gosh, I should have brought some water up here. That's a long sentence. But it captures a lot of nuance. And we talked a lot about taking specific words out, but we really want to make sure we capture the full picture of everything that we want to be included in this program. So we're starting high level here with this mission statement or the guiding light, and we're going to kind of go down into different layers and detail and flesh out what all is involved. So here's our vision and goals to achieve that mission statement. We'd like local governments to use tools available to make an informed decision and seek support, mainly in the form of funding. A lot of our project prioritization process now follows more of a qualitative approach instead of a quantitative approach, and we really want to bring data to drive those decisions through defining risk. We want equity to be brought into that equation. You know, that's a filter that we can put on, you know, post-flood risk calculation to see maybe where we should make a decision on moving forward with one project versus another. And lastly, I know the federal grant environment is a little bit murky right now, but our current MDP process doesn't always generate a cost-benefit ratio, and that's a critical line on grant applications. So we want to make sure that we're making that data available to pursue all funding opportunities that are available. We want to reduce the most risk for the least amount of money. This doesn't mean that we want to pursue the cheapest possible project. It means that we want to be really strategic in the decisions that we make. For example, let's say an area has a 2-year level of service, and maybe it takes $5 million to get to a 10-year level of service, and to get to our typical 100-year level of service, it takes $50 million. So that $5 million can provide some very incremental gains to mitigate flood risk for a wide variety of people, and maybe it makes most sense to move forward with that project rather than the whole $50 million project. Flood risk is intended to help us make those critical decisions. We want to integrate pluvial flooding into the risk assessment. You know, most regulatory floodplains start at about a 1 square mile drainage, and we're missing a lot of the system, and where flood risk may be even worse than along the riverine system. HECRAS 6.6 came out with storm drain pipes in it, which is great. So we can just import those and we can get the full picture of the system. And now with rain on mesh models, we can account for where every single drop of rain is going. We want to take a portfolio management approach to give planners a confident long-term outlook on and to address flood risk. We want to track losses avoided post-construction. I fully stole this one from Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, and I have no shame in it. It's a great tool to be able to communicate with the public and with elected officials. You know, they have a nice little dashboard that shows that they run their models through after observed events and basically calculate how much flood risk was mitigated with the improvements that they've made. And it's been a really helpful tool for them to be able to communicate why their funding is so important and why it's at the levels that it's at. We want to have a defensible, data-driven, and straightforward approach. We want to be able to explain this in a 5-minute period. We want it to be a really effective communication tool and be really useful for everybody. So those are the goals we're trying to achieve. Now let's talk a little bit about who's helped so far and where we want to go from here. Right now we're leading this initiative. Michael Baker has been helping us a lot on the Never Creek rain on mesh pilot, and they've advanced into the Goldsmith Gulch rain on mesh pilot. Thanks Jeff and his team for helping so much with developing some of the content that we're going to see here a little bit later. And also Jacob has been helping a lot with digitizing our master drainage plan data and helping set up that prioritization framework. But lastly, we want input from really everybody in this room. Our local government partners should have received a survey asking about flood risk, asking for your input. If you are a local government partner and you have not received this survey, please reach out to me and we can make sure that you have it. My contact info will be on the last slide here. And we're also considering starting a strategic advisory consultant team to really inform the process to make sure we have a really good technical basis for all the decisions we're making. So moving down a little bit further into the weeds where I like to live, how flood risk works is essentially this equation. Flood risk equals the probability of failure, or the likelihood of flooding in a given year, times the consequence of failure, or what are the people property impacts. So let's walk through how we can define more of the variables in that equation. First step in the overall process is to build district-wide rain-on-mesh models to be able to generate hazard data. So think depth times velocity grids, things like that. And also with the Goldsmith Gulch rain-on-mesh pilot, we're looking at what FAD assumptions can we bring into the rain-on-mesh modeling framework to make those rain-on-mesh models potentially regulatory in the future. We want to make sure we're maximizing our impact here. Just want to quickly differentiate between hazard and risk. Floodplain lines are hazard. They become risk once we have a people or property impact. So that guy on the beach, just looking at the shark is only a hazard at that point. Once he gets in the water and starts swimming with the shark for some unknown reason, the shark becomes a risk biting at his heels. So it's really those people, property, infrastructure impacts that translate hazards into risks. So next we would build out receptor data sets. So that's the consequence of a failure portion of the equation there. And we would also start to populate some of the background problems from previous MDPs, community reported flooding, other known issues from FADs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the build the district-wide data set pillar, or step one. So risk receptors. Right now we have them broken up into buildings and roads with a very simple, straightforward impact factor of a low, medium, and high, or a 1, 2, and 3 respectively. For buildings on the low end, that's like a shed or an auxiliary structure. And then for roads, those are private drives moving into a medium or a 2. That's a single-family residential or manufactured home for buildings. And for roads, that's really a 2-lane road. And then the 3, the really high in people property impacts, are hospitals, fire stations, commercial buildings for buildings, and highways and more than 3-lane roads for roads. And the figure on the right there is color-coded to kind of capture how that looks in practice. And then step 2 is extracting hazard data from those rain-on-mesh models. So that's the depth grids, depth times velocity. We do that for the 1 through 1,000 year storm to capture that probability piece. And then we intersect the hazard data with those receptors, the buildings or roads, to be able to calculate a flood risk factor. But what buckets of risk do we put that in? So a 0 would be not flooded for buildings. A 1 would be minor flooding. And I just the engineer in me needs to make sure that everybody sees the not to scale in the bottom corner there. A 2 is medium flooding, and a 3 is major flooding. All these have, numbers and data tied to the back end, but just want to show a more simplified approach for today. And then for roads, we're talking mostly about vehicle impacts. So it's a 0 for it's safe for vehicles, really no water on the road. A 1 is unsafe for small vehicles, and we're in the image there, we're protecting Colorado's favorite car, the Subaru Forester. I really only say that because I have one, but also not to scale. The number 2 is unsafe for all vehicles. So if we go back, you'll notice that the Subaru Forester is now getting picked up off the ground, and a 3 is really bad. Things are moving, buildings can be taken out. We're in a really bad situation with the 3. So now that we've defined both our impact factor and our buckets of risk, we're baking in that probability piece. So it's the overall flood risk for a given building or road would be the summation of that probability factor times the impact factor times the flood risk score for all of the different recurrence intervals listed there, the 1 through 1,000 year. Each of those are put into a different bin weight, where that overall bin weight sums up to 1. So the maximum flood risk at a building or a road would be a 3 times a 3, or a 9 overall, where really high numbers indicate either low levels of service or a very widespread impact of flooding. So what can we do with that data? Once we have all our flood risk scores calculated, we can start to do some analysis through the watershed to identify where are our hotspots, where do we have the worst flooding occurring. We can start to discretize that into different problem areas and attribute those and look at, from just a high level based on flood risk alone, where should we be looking at prioritizing our dollars. Then we can take it a step further and plug in the MDP proposed alternatives and run those through the model and see what sort of flood risk reduction we get with the currently identified alternatives. And then we can sort of see a return on investment per dollar spent on those various major drainage plan alternatives, and then start to stack those up against each other and see where are we getting the most bang for our buck, where can we be the most responsible with public dollars. So that's all great in theory, but let's talk about some examples. Baker did some flood risk calculations for Niagara Creek, both for existing conditions and then 8 proposed projects. The 8 projects are shown in the blue circles there. They're all throughout the watershed in varying scales and scope. Some are simple culvert replacements, upsizing. Some are pond construction. Some are much more systemic solutions of thousands of feet of opening up the channel and multiple culvert upsizings. And the other thing I want to highlight is that there are actually 2 circles at that downstream end over the same exact area, so that it's also a way that we can look at various alternatives in a given area. So lots of numbers here. Let's zoom in on just the existing risk scores here. Those are the same 8 projects identified, and the building and road existing condition risk scores. So again, higher numbers are worse flooding, either at a lower recurrence interval or more widespread flooding. This is just summarizing the data, but we can get into much deeper levels and sort it in many other ways. And then we can put those proposed improvements in and look at the overall risk reduced that each of those are doing throughout the system. And then we can start to look at the overall cost of those projects and the risk return on investment, or the dollar per risk reduced that we can achieve with each of those given projects. And we definitely don't want to be generating data for data's sake. We want the data to be really informative, insightful, and actionable. So we can follow the clues here and kind of take a look behind the curtain here and see this in a different way, where now we're sorted by benefit rank, really just by that risk return on investment column. And I thought it was really interesting to see these results. They kind of surprised me, to be honest. I thought the project number 2 there, which is multiple thousands of feet of opening up the channel and mitigating risk at a lot of manufactured homes, was going to be the biggest needle mover in terms of return on investment. But it was actually this culvert at Huron project, which is a simple culvert upsizing. It's not, dare I say, a sexy project, but it's one that gets you a modest risk reduction for a very reasonable cost, and thus it becomes your highest return on investment. Another way we can look at this is sorting by those needle movers. What are the projects that will get us the most risk reduced overall? And then that multiple thousands of feet channels and structures at the manufactured homes now does become that number 1 project. So the idea behind this is just that you can sort the data in many different ways. It just helps you determine what fits your priorities and how can we best communicate this to the public, your public officials, and various groups. And the last way we can look at this is comparing alternatives within a project area. So 3 and 8 were those 2 circles at the downstream end there. And one of these has a much higher needle moving than the other one. That kind of shows that maybe that bottom one isn't an alternative worth considering or pursuing. So it can help you make critical infrastructure decisions within a project as well as on a portfolio basis. So, in conclusion, flood risk is a quantitative, data-driven approach to maximize our impact. What are the next steps looking like? We're going to finish the Goldsmith Gulch rain on mesh pilot. That should have some really good information on what we want to do to fit rain on mesh models to a regulatory framework and help inform the overall risk approach. And then we'll move into a much more detailed development of that flood risk approach with, data standards, modeling standards, all of that super fun stuff. And then we hope to roll this out to the full district and start to develop rain on mesh models everywhere and make sure this data is available for everybody. That's a much longer term outlook. We don't know how long that's going to take, but I'm really excited to hopefully make that happen in a reasonable time period. And again, we're very interested in everybody's feedback. So if you've got any questions, my email's listed there, and I look forward to hearing from folks. Thank you.